So this is just a nice tutorial to kind of rest your fingers in your mind since the last one. I call this one Lay Me Down in Green Pastures. You're going to, of course, draw your silo, draw your barn, draw your cows so that you have everything drawn. You're going to use a wide 2-inch brush. You're going to use your number 4, your number 2. If you don't have a 4 and you want to use your 6, that's fine. You're going to use a number 1 rigger and a real thin liner. You're going to put on some Misket beforehand, and you'll also use salt. Colors, we're going to do cerulean blue or any of your light blues that you like. We're going to be using ultramarine blue or any of your royal blue colors that you like. We're also going to be using yellow ochre that we're going to be mixing with our burnt umber color. We're also going to be using the burnt umber, of course. That will be used for the dirt color. We'll be using black. A lot of it is watered down. We'll be using sap green for the grasses and a very, very small amount of alizarin crimson or any of your pinks for the cow noses. You'll also be using a tissue to blot out your clouds and wipe out your clouds in your sky. You want to misket that tree that is in between the silo and the barn, and also just the top of the grassy area, not all of the grasses. We're going to start with the sky, and I'm doing it wet on wet. So you want to wet your whole sky area first, and then we're going to be putting on a pretty intense wash of cerulean blue. You want it to be nice and wet, but you also want it to be pretty intense because this is a really nice blue sky, and you want to make your clouds that you wipe out very evident. So if you're too light with your blues and you blot them out, you won't even really be seeing them. So make your blue wash really nice and intense. Once you get your blue on, you want to lift up your paper and wipe up the edge to all of your paint that's on the table. You don't want that to come back in on your picture. So you want to wipe that up. I always hold my picture up and let my color move. So you can see here in the video how it's moving towards the top of the picture. But you want to let it move so that you get a nice soft wash with all of that blue. Then you're going to start to blot out and wipe your sky. I blotted and wiped depending on what kind of cloud structures you want, but you want to get a nice mixture. You want to get some nice white clouds, and then you want to also keep in some of your really nice blue sky. Moving away from my sky to give it time to dry, I'm going to move down to that section of dirt, and I'm mixing burnt umber along with some yellow ochre, and I'm going to paint in all of the dirt area. Once I get that painted in, I'm going to salt it, and then I am going to drop in some very watered down but intense black into the salt and let it bleed and move around through the salt granules. You want to make sure that you stay nice and wet so that your salt will have an opportunity to work, as well as the salting and the black that you drop in the salt. Now, while we let that salt work, I'm going to dry brush the boards in my barn. I'm using watered down black, but you could use watered down black mixed with umber. You could just use plain umber. You could use burnt sienna. You could use cerulean blue mixed with a little bit of black for some grays. It's up to you what colors that you want your boards to be dry brushed with. Since I'm trying to keep my barn looking white, I don't want to use really light colors to dry brush because then I'm going to lose that. After my dry brushing, there is a section on the roof that is shadowed. So I'm going to go ahead and paint that section in. I'm painting that in just with some watered down black. Now, after I get that painted in, I'm going to use some burnt umber and just dry brush horizontally on my silo, just to start giving it a little bit of shape. Just a few lines, not everywhere, but just enough to give it some shape. I'm also going to take a little bit of time now and actually draw in my boards, because when I outline them with my rigger, I want them to be straight or at least vertically positioned so that I don't make my barn look as though it's tilting. So you can take a couple minutes and line your barn boards. They don't have to all be the same width. Some can be wider, some can be thinner. But you do want to make them straight up and down vertically. Once you get them all drawn in, then I'm going to be using my rigger, and I will be painting them in. You can use your rigger or your fine liner, whichever you feel more comfortable with. You can also use a black or gray watercolor pencil if that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. But eventually you should get used to working with a fine liner or a rigger. I'm using my watered down black for my lines, and I'm just painting right over my pencil lines. Once you get all of your board lines painted, then you can go actually in and paint some of the individual boards. They don't all have to just be white, so you can use watered down black. You can use watered down black mixed with some umber. You can use cerulean blue mixed with some black, but you want to pick out some boards that you are going to actually paint in and give them a whole shade of color. This isn't the boards that are missing that will have black painted on them. This is the boards that actually have no paint left on them, so they are just a gray color or a black color or really whatever color you want to make them. But you want to go ahead in and paint some of those boards in so that your barn is just not all dry brushed. I'm painting in those little black markings under the overhang. It must be like little pieces of wood that help to hold the roof up on the overhang, but I'm just using black for that. With that same watered down black, I'm painting the shadow that is caused by the overhang. It's both on the front of the barn and will also be on the side of the barn. But you want to paint that nice overhang shadow on. While I'm using that color, I'm going to continue to paint in a couple individual boards. This is not shadows, this is some individual boards on the barn itself. You want to make sure that you have enough dry brushing on your barn. And now I'm going to do this little additional shed. This is the area that is under that thin tin roof before it meets up with the boards. And then I will also be using my rigger to line those boards. I'm laying my rigger horizontally and vertically on some of those boards, and I'm using that rigger because it's not going to give me a perfect fine line. Some of those areas in between the boards are uneven, So by laying your rigger down on those areas, that's making that uneven look instead of trying to manually paint that. Once that's all dry, I'm giving a wash of burnt umber to my silo. The whole silo is just getting a wash of burnt umber. Once it's painted in but still nice and wet, I'm going to use some watered down black on the left hand side of the silo to help it with a little bit of shadowing. So a nice wash of watered down black on the left hand side of the shadow while everything is still wet. You want it to be wet so it'll have a nice soft bleed. And this is just one of a couple shadows we're going to be putting on. But that whole left side of my shadow, while it's wet, is going to have that nice, soft, darkened side to it. So some watered down black, nice and wet, all the way down the left-hand side of the silo. When you're finished, hold your paper up to allow that paint to kind of have a nice soft run. That way you won't have a hard line. I'm adding just a couple lines while it's wet, again, just to help to give my silo some shape. While my silo is drying, I'm going to go down to my cows. I need to put my shadows on my cows first, because once I paint in the dark spots on my cows, I don't want to add shadowing for those dark black spots to bleed and not have nice hard edges. So I'm doing all of my shadows on my cows first. Watered down black, some soft edges, some harder edges. Just refer to your picture and you can see exactly where your shadows should go. These are just the shadows on the black and white cows. The black cow will just be painted in black, and his shadows will actually be painted with an extra layer of black around them so that you'll have two tones of black on the black cow. Now you can see exactly where I put my shadows. The black cow, again, is just painted with a wash of black totally. And then once he's painted in, when it dries, I will paint in some darker black around where the lighter light sources are hitting the cow. So some of his skin will be darker, some of the cow hide will be darker, and some will be the original wash of black, which will be a lighter tone of the black. While you're waiting for the black cowl to dry, for the first wash to dry, I'm going back in and I'm actually putting in some additional shadowing on my other cowls so that I have different different values of shadow. Some are darker, some are a little bit lighter, but they're still just the shadows. And I want all of those shadows to dry before I start to put my spots on. Now my black cowl is going to get those the additional wash of black. This is the areas where the light is not hitting. It gets an additional wash of black, leaving your light sources just the one wash of black. And now I can start to paint in my eyes and my spots on my two other cowls because my shadows are now dry and complete. So now I can go ahead in and put in my dark spots. Now you want to make sure everything is really dry, and you are going to shadow in the whole front to your barn. A nice wash of watered down black, and you're going to paint that over the whole front of your barn, as well as the part on the side of the barn where the overhang is that is causing that uneven shadow on the side of the barn. Nice wash, smaller brush for this thin piece on the left, and then I'll revert to my big flat brush to go ahead and do the whole front. Waiting for some things to dry, I'll use that tiny little bit of of your alizarin crimson to paint in the pink on my two white cows. Little bit on the front cow and a very tiny little bit on the back cow behind him. The uneven shadow on the side of the barn, you're making it uneven just because the overhang, the boards are a little bit uneven. They're weathered and old, so they're not a perfectly straight line all the way across. So I'm making my shadow reflect that by having it not perfectly straight all the way across. The little shed that is in front of the barn, it also is going to get shadowed, but it's going to have a lighter shadow, not quite as intense as the shadow on the front of the main barn. It is getting shadowed, but not quite as dark. The two fence posts I already dry brushed, and now I'll put a real light wash of watered down black on them, and I will put some additional black, a little bit more intense, along the left side to act as a shadow on those fence posts. Nice and dry brushed, or you can salt them, but you want them to look like nice, rough, old weathered posts. To my grass, but of course I want to remove my misket first because I don't want to paint in my grass, then remove my misket and have a hard line just along the top of the grass. So I'm removing all of my misket on the grass so that I could paint my grass in all as one separate entity, no separations of the grass. I'm going to put two washes on the grass. So there's going to be one flat green wash, and then once that dries, I'll put a second individual wash on with my rigger so that you can see individual pieces of grass with that second wash. I'm just going to be using sap green for those washes, but if you want to use some umber or some a little bit of black or even a little bit of blue, you can to change up the colors. Just to get my shed out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and line it before I start my grasses. Again, laying my rigger on its side to give me some uneven space lines. But then once I start doing my vertical lines for my boards, I'm using my nice rigger, my nice thin rigger to make my lines nice and straight. If you want to use a ruler and draw them on first, you certainly can, but on this shed, I did not. Painting in my grass, again, I'm just using some sap green So I'm painting in little bits at a time. I'll paint in the very solid sap towards the bottom of my paper first, and then I'll pull that sap out and do my thin pieces with a rigger or a much smaller brush. Then I'll move on, do another little section. That way I'm not getting any hard lines. However, if you do get hard lines, it's not going to hurt anything because you're going to be creating hard lines anyway with your second wash of color. So it really will not affect anything. But I'm doing just a little bit at a time. You don't want hard horizontal lines. Getting hard vertical lines is fine. Putting in my shadowed plant life on the left-hand side behind the fencing, I just used sap mixed with some black, and I used more black than sap because it's in heavy shadow. So in between my posts of my fence and along my silo is some shadowed plant life. I went ahead and put that in with my rigger, again with some sap green and some black, more black than sap. Using watered down black, I'm putting on my shadow on the ground. So there is some shadowing at the base of my silo. It moves a little bit forward as it comes in front of the shed, and then moves even more forward as it comes towards the black cow. Now the shadow on the side of the silo from that tree, I strongly suggest you watch the next couple minutes of the video before you actually start to paint, so you can see how I actually painted the shadow. I'm using watered down black, but it still is pretty intense. And this is the shadow of the tree that is reflected on the right side of the silo. There is going to be additional shadowing that I'm going to put in on the left-hand side. So in order for you not to have to hurry and try to do things back and forth, I suggest you really watch the next few minutes of the video so that you'll know what I'm doing, you'll know what to expect, and it'll be much easier for you to do it then. Whew, now that shadow is done. So take a deep breath, and we're going to go back down to our grass and put the second wash on of the sap green. This can be the same color of sap green, or you can deepen it a little bit with blues or blacks or umbers, whatever you prefer. But now you're doing some solid color at the very base of your paper, but then you are going to pull out actual strands of grass with your rigger. You're going to do that the whole way across the bottom. And when you're done, this is what your bottom of your grasses should look like. Nice and individual grasses all the way across the base. I'm going to take the misket off of my tree now because all of my shadows are done in between where the tree is. So I can go ahead and safely take off my misket of my tree. And then I will go back in and put some shadows on my posts, my horizontal posts on my fence. And I'm going to put another additional little bit of shadowing along the side of the silo. If you feel the need that you have to. If you're already dark enough, then you do not have to do this step. I actually drew the lines in that I'm going to paint on my shadow because you definitely do not want these lines to not be straight. If they are to the left or to the right, it's going to make your silo look off center. So take that little bit of time and go ahead and draw on your lines. You don't have to draw them real dark, but you want to draw them so that you can at least see them because you're going to be putting them on with Chinese white and with your watered down black. It doesn't matter which ones you do first, truthfully. I did my white ones first. My white ones are my vertical lines. My black ones are my horizontal lines. Take your time. Use your fine rigger. If you do not want to use a rigger, you can use a white watercolor pencil. If you use a white watercolor pencil, you want to make sure that you keep a nice sharp tip on it so that your lines are nice and thin. Once all your horizontal or your vertical lines are put on, I took my number 2 round and I just used the same Chinese white, but I dry brushed horizontally here and there, just again to make that silo look old, weathered. You don't have to do it everywhere, but I did want to have some dry brushing going horizontally. And if you look at your picture, you'll see what I mean. When you start doing your horizontal lines with your black, your watered down black, you want to make sure that you also do those nice and thin, and you also want to make sure that you can see them. So you have to make sure that your paint is intense enough that you can see those lines. They are going to be horizontal. Again, I sketched those in so that they would be nice and straight because I did not want my silo to look off center or look crooked. Drawing those lines not perfectly straight vertically or horizontally or however they should be, the ones horizontally have a little bit of an arch to them, you will throw off the visibility, the way your eye looks at the silo. So you want to make sure that your lines are correct. Painting in that tree, I just use black, darker towards the bottom of the tree because it's in a heavier shadow. As I went up the tree, I got a little bit lighter. I blotted it a little bit with a paper towel, and I also threw some salt on it. Once that was nice and dry, then I took my fine rigger and drew in some additional branches. Don't make too many. This is an old, probably dead tree, so it doesn't have a lot of little fine branches. It doesn't have a lot of branches at all. They probably all rotted off, so you don't want to spend a lot of time making too many branches. Now even I find places on my painting that I do not like, and my salt really didn't work like I wanted it to on my dirt. So I am going to make additional texturing with my sponge. This wasn't a planned event, but I was so disappointed in my salting that I am using my sponge and a little bit of watered down black to go ahead and make my dirt have a lot more texture to it. If your salting worked, then please do not do that step at all. It's not necessary. Now I'm going to do my fine white wire lines that connect my posts. Again, a nice super fine rigger or liner. Make sure you have enough white paint, enough of a thickness that it'll show up so you don't have to redo it. You don't want to have to do fine lines. If you want to, again, you can use your white watercolor pencil, but you want to make sure that you get it as intense as your white paint so it becomes nice and visible. If you need to add in additional branches on your tree, if you think you need them, now would be the time to do that. So I hope you enjoyed this painting. Not too much thought processes in this one. A nice, easygoing farm. Enjoy and happy painting.